8:02 p.m. Heavy snow fell over a desolate street near Boston's South Station. The wind howled, forcing commuters to vanish into the shadows of the city. A young woman dashed across the sidewalk, her breath coming in frantic, jagged gasps. A few meters behind, two men in dark coats closed the gap with predatory speed. "Ma'am, wait! We just want to talk!" She didn't look back. She was terrified. Suddenly, a 41-year-old single dad shoveling snow beside his small soup truck looked up. He threw the door open and shouted, "She's with us!" The two men froze. He had no idea whose life he had just changed. Thomas Miller was 41 years old, a man whose hands were calloused by labor and whose heart was softened by fatherhood. He had been a widower for 5 long years, a period of time that felt like both a lifetime and a single aching breath. Thomas lived for one person, his 9-year-old daughter, Chloe. Together, they operated a modest food truck positioned strategically near the bustling Boston train station. It wasn't a fancy business. It was a silver trailer with a hand-painted sign that simply read, "The Warm Ladle." Thomas didn't sell gourmet fusion or trendy snacks. He sold soup, hot, thick, soul-cleansing soup made from recipes his grandmother had brought over from the old country. In the brutal chill of a Boston winter, that little truck was more than a business. It was a lighthouse in a sea of freezing gray. The routine of their lives was rhythmic and peaceful. Every morning began at 4 a.m. in their small apartment kitchen, where the air would soon fill with the scent of simmering onions, roasted garlic, and slow-cooked beef. Chloe would sit at the small wooden table, swinging her legs and helping her father peel potatoes or label the paper cups with little smiley faces. She was a bright, observant child who had inherited her mother's empathetic eyes. By 7 a.m., they would hitch the truck to their old pickup and navigate the icy streets to their corner near the station. Thomas handled the heavy lifting and the cooking, while Chloe took pride in being the chief of smiles, handing out napkins and making sure every customer felt seen. Thomas watched the world through the steam rising from his large metal pots. He saw the tired faces of office workers, the shivering forms of the homeless, and the hurried pace of students. He knew the regulars by their favorite flavors. Mr. Henderson liked the spicy lentil, while the young nurse, Sarah, always chose the creamy tomato. To Thomas, the act of serving soup was a form of silent communication. In a city that often felt cold and indifferent, he provided a small pocket of humanity. He didn't make a lot of money, but he made a difference. He taught Chloe that wealth wasn't measured by what you kept in a bank, but by how much warmth you could give to a stranger. One particularly freezing Tuesday evening, as the snow began to pile up in drifts, Chloe looked up at her father while she was stacking cups. "Dad, why do people always smile when they eat your soup?" she asked, her voice small against the whistling wind. Thomas stopped stirring the beef barley and looked at his daughter, his eyes softening. "Because warmth helps, Chloe. When your body is freezing, a little heat feels like a hug. And sometimes a hug is all someone needs to remember they aren't alone." He didn't know then that he was about to provide a different kind of warmth, a shield against a much colder threat than the Boston winter. Behind the steam and the simple service, Thomas carried a history of quiet resilience. He had lost his wife, Mary, to a sudden illness that had left him with a mountain of medical bills and a broken heart. He had sold their house and most of their belongings to buy the Warm Ladle, choosing a life on the streets over the suffocating cubicle of his old accounting job. He wanted to be present for Chloe, to show her that even when the world takes everything from you, you can still find something to give. His hands were often cracked from the cold and the hot water, but his gaze was always steady. He was a man who had made peace with his scars, and that peace was what drew people to his window. While Thomas and Chloe were the heart of the street, the woman who would soon collide with their lives came from a world of glass towers and silent boardrooms. Elena Vance was 33 years old, and on the surface, she had everything. She was the sole heir to Vance Technologies, a multi-billion-dollar empire that shaped the city's skyline. But that evening, Elena felt smaller than she ever had. She had just walked out of a high-profile charity gala, her silk dress hidden beneath an expensive wool coat. She was fleeing a life of suffocating expectations and a recent, terrifying development within her own company. She had discovered a secret she wasn't supposed to know, and for the first time in her life, her money and her name couldn't protect her. Elena had tried to lose herself in the crowd near the station, hoping to find a taxi or a train that would take her away from the watchful eyes of her family's security and the associates who were now shadowing her every move. She was panicked, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every footstep behind her sounded like a threat. Every shadow seemed to reach for her. She was a woman who had never known what it was like to be truly vulnerable, and now, in the middle of a snowstorm, she was utterly alone. She turned a corner, her boots slipping on the black ice, and that was when she saw the two men. They weren't wearing uniforms, but their movements were coordinated and relentless. They were coming for her, and there was nowhere left to run. The two men were professionals. They didn't run. They moved with a steady, intimidating efficiency. They were dressed in expensive, nondescript overcoats that hid their intentions as well as their frames. "Ma'am, please, we just need to talk. Your father is worried," one of them called out. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying edge of steel that suggested he wouldn't take no for an answer. Elena backed away, her hands trembling. She knew these men. They worked for her uncle, the man who was currently trying to push her out of the company. If she went with them now, she wouldn't be going home. She would be going to a private facility where her voice would be silenced forever. Thomas had been outside the truck, using a wide plastic shovel to clear a path for the late-night commuters. He had noticed the young woman the moment she rounded the corner. Her panic was a frequency he could sense from 20 yards away. It wasn't just the cold, it was the look in her eyes, the look of someone who was being hunted. He saw her stumble, and he saw the two men approaching. He had seen enough of the world to know when a conversation wasn't a conversation. He saw the way they fanned out to cut off her exits. He saw Elena's hand go to her throat, her face pale as the falling snow. Without thinking, Thomas dropped the shovel. It hit the pavement with a hollow clang. He moved toward the door of the soup truck, his eyes fixed on the men. Chloe was watching from inside, her face pressed against the glass. Thomas didn't know who the woman was. He didn't know if she was a criminal or a saint. He only knew that she was terrified and that the men were the cause of it. He reached out, grabbed the handle of the truck's sliding door, and pulled it wide. The light from inside spilled out onto the snow, a warm, golden glow that illuminated Elena's desperate face. "She's with us!" Thomas shouted. His voice was a thunderclap in the quiet street. It was deep, resonant, and carried the absolute authority of a man who was standing his ground. The two men stopped in their tracks. They looked at the bearded man in the stained apron, then at the modest food truck. They looked confused, as if they had walked into the wrong scene of a movie. Elena froze, her eyes wide as she looked at Thomas. She didn't know him. She had never seen him before in her life. But in that moment, he was the only thing standing between her and a nightmare. "Excuse me," one of the men said, stepping forward. He tried to reclaim his professional composure. "This doesn't concern you, pal. The lady is having a medical episode. We're here to help her." Elena shook her head frantically, her voice caught in her throat. Thomas didn't budge. He stepped in front of Elena, his large frame acting as a physical barrier. He didn't raise his fists, but his posture was immovable. "I said she's with us," Thomas repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "She's been helping us all evening. We were just about to close up. Now, unless you're here for the clam chowder, I suggest you move along." The atmosphere turned electric. The men looked at each other, gauging the situation. They were trained to handle corporate espionage and discreet extractions, not a confrontation with a local vendor in front of potential witnesses. A few commuters had stopped to watch the scene. The men knew that any physical altercation would draw the police, and a police report was the last thing their employer wanted. The lead man narrowed his eyes, staring at Thomas with a cold, calculating intensity. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he hissed. Thomas didn't blink. "I know a woman who wants to be left alone when I see one, and I know two guys who need to leave when I tell them to. Now leave." Thomas felt the weight of the situation. He knew these weren't common thugs. Their clothes were too nice, their movements too practiced. But his protective instinct, honed by years of keeping Chloe safe in a world that had already taken so much from them, flared up like a furnace. He felt Elena's presence behind him, her shallow breathing, her trembling hand on the edge of the truck's frame. To Thomas, she wasn't an heiress or a stranger. She was a human being in need of a harbor. And Thomas Miller, the man who sold warmth, was not about to let the cold in. For a long, agonizing minute, no one moved. The only sound was the wind whipping the snow around the silver trailer. Chloe's small hand appeared on the edge of the door, her eyes wide with worry. Finally, the lead man adjusted his coat. He gave Elena a look that promised this wasn't over. "Have it your way," he muttered. He turned on his heel, and his partner followed. They vanished into the swirling white curtains of the storm as quickly as they had appeared. Elena collapsed against the side of the truck, her legs finally giving out. The adrenaline that had sustained her vanished, leaving only a cold, hollow exhaustion. Thomas didn't ask questions. He reached down, his large, warm hands catching Elena's elbows before she hit the ice. "Easy there," he murmured. "You're safe now. Come inside. It's too cold to be standing out here." He guided her into the cramped but cozy interior of the truck. The air inside was thick with the aroma of simmering broth and the gentle hum of a portable heater. It felt like stepping into a different world. Chloe was already moving, her small hands reaching for a clean paper cup. She didn't say a word. She simply filled the cup with steaming, golden chicken noodle soup and handed it to Elena. Elena took the cup, her fingers numb and shaking. She couldn't speak. She just nodded her thanks, her eyes filling with tears that she couldn't suppress any longer. She took a sip of the soup. It was simple, honest, and incredibly hot. As the warmth spread through her chest, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She looked at the man who had just risked his safety for a stranger. He was back at the stove, tidying up as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He wasn't demanding an explanation. He wasn't asking for her name. He was just providing a sanctuary. "Thank you," Elena finally whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas looked over his shoulder and gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Don't mention it. Winters in Boston are hard enough without people making them worse. Stay as long as you need to get your strength back." Chloe sat down on a small stool next to Elena, looking at her with genuine concern. "Do you want a cracker?" she asked, holding out a small plastic packet. Elena laughed, a wet, shaky sound that turned into a sob. She reached out and took the cracker. "Yes, please, I'd love one." In that moment, the heiress to a billion-dollar fortune felt a deeper connection to this father and daughter than she did to anyone in her own social circle. As Elena warmed up, she looked around the small space. It was impeccably clean, despite its age. There were pictures taped to the metal walls, drawings Chloe had made, a faded photo of a woman with a beautiful smile, and a calendar marked with school events. This truck was their entire world, a fortress of love built on a foundation of hard work. Elena realized that she had spent her life surrounded by people who wanted something from her, but Thomas and Chloe were only interested in what they could give her. The simplicity of their kindness was more powerful than any legal team or security details she had ever employed. A few minutes later, the silence of the street was broken again. This time, it wasn't the sound of footsteps, but the low, powerful rumble of engines. Two massive black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their tires crunching on the fresh snow. Elena stiffened, her hand tightening around the soup cup. Thomas moved to the window, his expression guarded. He saw a group of men in tactical gear and suits stepping out of the vehicles. They weren't like the two men from before. These men carried the official authority of a high-end private security firm. One of them, an older man with gray hair and a weary expression, stepped toward the truck. "Ma'am? Elena?" the man called out. He sounded relieved, not threatening. Elena stood up, recognizing the voice. It was Marcus, the head of her personal security team. Men she actually trusted. Men who had been searching for her since she disappeared from the gala. She looked at Thomas, then at Marcus. "I'm in here," she shouted. Marcus reached the door of the truck, his eyes scanning the interior. He saw Elena, wrapped in her expensive coat, holding a paper soup cup. He saw the single dad and the little girl. He took off his hat, his breath fogging in the air. "Thank God. We've been searching every block for 3 miles. Your uncle's men were spotted in the area." "Hrunan." The revelation hit the small space of the truck like a physical weight. Thomas looked at Elena, his eyebrows rising. He saw the way Marcus addressed her with such deference. He saw the fleet of expensive vehicles and the professional team standing guard. He realized then that the woman he had protected wasn't just a lost commuter. She was someone important, someone powerful. Elena stood up, her composure returning as her world caught up with her. She looked at Thomas, her eyes lingering on his face. "You saved me," she said, "and you didn't even know who I was." Thomas shrugged, a slow smile spreading across his bearded face. "I knew you were someone who needed help. That's enough for me." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "Sir, do you realize who this is? This is Elena Vance. She is the chairman of Vance Technologies." Thomas blinked. He had heard of the company, of course. Everyone in Boston had. They built the sensors for the subway and the software for the hospitals. He looked at Elena again, seeing the burden of her name in the way she carried her shoulders. "Well," Thomas said softly, "Ms. Vance, I hope the soup was to your liking. It's my grandmother's recipe." Elena reached into her pocket, but Marcus stopped her, shaking his head. Elena smiled. "Not tonight, Marcus. I don't want to pay for this with a check. I want to pay for it with a promise." The days following the encounter were a blur for Elena. With Marcus and her loyal security team back in place, she was able to navigate the corporate minefield her uncle had laid for her. She used the information she had discovered to secure her position and expose the corruption within the board. The men in dark coats were dealt with through legal channels, and the threat to her life vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But through all the meetings and the legal battles, she couldn't stop thinking about the silver truck near South Station. She couldn't forget the taste of the soup or the sound of Thomas's voice saying, "She's with us." A week later, a heavy, polished black sedan pulled up to the corner where the warm ladle was parked. It was a clear, bitter day, and the lunch rush had just ended. Thomas was wiping down the counter, and Chloe was doing her homework on a small table in the corner of the truck. Elena stepped out of the car. She wasn't wearing a silk dress or a frantic expression this time. She was dressed in a simple, elegant coat and jeans. She walked up to the window and Thomas looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He didn't say a word. He just reached for a clean cup. "Beef barley today, Miss Vance?" he asked, a twinkle in his eye. Elena laughed, leaning against the counter. "Please, just Elena. And yes, beef barley sounds perfect." As he served her, Elena looked around at the modest setup. She saw the dented pots and the flickering heater. She saw the way Thomas looked at Chloe with such pride. She realized that while she had spent her life building an empire of silicon and glass, Thomas had built an empire of heart and soul. "You protected someone you didn't even know," she said, her voice dropping. "I've lived in this city my whole life, and I've never met anyone like you. Why did you do it?" Thomas set the cup down and leaned his elbows on the counter. "You look like you needed help, Elena. It's that simple. There's too much calculating in the world today. Everyone wants to know what they get out of a situation before they decide to act. But if I stopped to calculate the risk, I would have missed the chance to do the right thing. My wife used to say that the coldest thing in Boston isn't the snow, it's the way people look past each other. I try not to do that." Elena took a sip of the soup, feeling that familiar warmth bloom in her chest. "Why do you help strangers? Not just me, but everyone I saw you serving that night?" Thomas looked out at the street. "Because winters here are hard. Not just the weather, but life. Everyone is carrying a heavy bucket, Elena. A little soup and a kind word. It makes the bucket feel a bit lighter." The conversation deepened as Elena stayed by the window. She told him about her world, the pressure of leading a company that seemed to prioritize profits over people, the loneliness of being at the top, and the fear she had felt when her own family turned against her. Thomas listened with the patience of a man who had seen the worst of life and decided to respond with the best of himself. He didn't offer business advice, but he offered perspective. He talked about the strength found in small things, the importance of keeping your hands on the ground even when your head is in the clouds. Elena found herself breathing easier in the presence of this man who didn't want anything from her. Elena put the cup down and looked him in the eye. "I want to help you, Thomas. I have resources. I could give you a fleet of these trucks. I could buy you a restaurant in the North End. You wouldn't have to worry about money ever again." Thomas looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Chloe. He shook his head slowly. "I appreciate the offer, truly. But I like my truck. I like being right here on this corner where people need me. If I moved to a fancy restaurant, I'd lose the very people I'm trying to help. And I don't want Chloe to grow up thinking that every problem is solved with a big check." Elena was stunned. She was used to people asking for things: investments, favors, donations. To have someone turn down a life-changing fortune was something she hadn't prepared for. But she also understood. Thomas was a man of integrity, and his wealth was his freedom. "I respect that," she said softly. "But let me do something. Not for you, but for the city. I want to start a program. We'll call it Warm Nights. Vance Technologies will fund a network of mobile soup kitchens across the city during the winter months. We'll provide free meals to anyone who needs them. No questions asked. But I need someone to run it. Someone who knows how to listen to the machines and the people." Thomas considered this. He saw the potential to help thousands of people, to turn his little warm ladle philosophy into a citywide movement. He looked at Chloe, who was watching him with wide, expectant eyes. "I'll do it," Thomas said, "but on one condition. No one needs to know my name. No press conferences, no plaques, just the soup and the warmth. That's all that matters." Elena smiled, reaching out to shake his hand. "Deal. No one will ever know it was you. But they'll know someone was looking out for them." A year passed. The following winter was one of the harshest in Boston's history. The temperatures plummeted to record lows, and the snow fell in relentless waves. But this time, the city was ready. Across the most vulnerable neighborhoods, silver trucks, modeled after Thomas's original trailer, began to appear. They were staffed by volunteers and funded by an anonymous endowment from Vance Technologies. They became a symbol of hope. People didn't just go there for food. They went there to feel with us. The Warm Nights program became a national model for how corporate wealth could be channeled into grassroots humanity. The impact was measurable. Hospitals reported fewer cases of hypothermia among the city's homeless population. Shelters felt the pressure ease as more people were fed and given a warm place to sit for a few moments. The silver trucks were more than just food stations. They were community hubs. Elena had ensured that each truck was equipped with information about local services, health clinics, and job training programs. She had taken Thomas's hug in a cup and scaled it up, proving that a massive corporation could indeed have a soul if it were guided by the right heart. Elena Vance was no longer the frightened woman running through the snow. She had transformed her company into a force for social good, balancing the high-tech world with a newfound appreciation for high-touch humanity. She was often seen at the Warm Nights headquarters, but her favorite place was still a quiet corner near South Station. She had become a frequent visitor to Thomas's truck, though she always made sure to arrive when the crowds were thin. They had developed a deep platonic bond, a friendship built on mutual respect and the shared memory of a cold night in the storm. One Tuesday evening, exactly a year after their first meeting, Thomas was closing up for the night. The snow was falling again, a soft, silent blanket that muffled the sounds of the city. He was humming to himself as he scrubbed the counters. Suddenly, he heard the familiar crunch of tires. A black sedan pulled up, and Elena stepped out. She looked happy, her face glowing with the success of the program's expansion. She walked up to the window, and Chloe, now 10 years old and a bit taller, beamed at her. "Hi, Elena. Do you want the special tonight? It's spicy lentil." Elena laughed, tapping the counter. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Chloe." As Thomas prepared the soup, Chloe looked at Elena and then at her father. She had seen Elena visiting many times, but she still remembered the night of the men in dark coats. She leaned over the counter, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Are you with us again tonight, Elena?" she asked. Elena looked at the father and daughter, at the warm light of the truck, and at the city that was a little bit warmer because of them. She smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. "Yes, Chloe," she whispered. "I think I'm always with you now." Thomas handed her the soup, their fingers brushing briefly. There was no need for words. They were part of a silent pact, a commitment to keep the darkness at bay one cup at a time. Elena sat on the small stool, enjoying the heat of the soup, while Thomas finished his chores. The warm ladle was just a small truck on a big street, but to those who knew its story, it was the center of the universe. It was the place where a single dad had stood his ground against the cold, and where an heiress had found her soul. As the lights of the truck finally flickered off, Thomas walked Elena to her car. The city around them was quiet, the snow continuing to fall in a rhythmic dance. Thomas looked up at the sky, feeling the cold air on his face. He felt a sense of profound contentment. He was still just a man with a truck and a daughter, but he knew that his life had an echo. He knew that because of one choice on one cold night, the world was a little less indifferent. He turned back to the truck where Chloe was waiting for him, her small flashlight cutting through the dark. "Ready to go home, Dad?" she called out. Thomas smiled, picking up his keys. "Ready, Chloe. Let's go." They walked toward their pickup truck, their shadows stretching long across the fresh snow. Elena watched them go, her heart full. She knew that she would see them again soon, but for now she was content to just be part of the silence. The machines of the city were still humming, but the song they sang was different now. It was a song of warmth, of community, and of the simple, powerful truth that no one has to walk through the storm alone. If you were moved by this story of courage, kindness, and the unexpected ways our lives can intersect, please like and subscribe to High TL Stories. We bring you stories every day that remind us of the warmth we can find even in the coldest winters. Thank you for watching, and remember, the next time you see someone in need, don't forget to tell them, "You're with us." See you in the next story.